4 hours and 17 minutes. That's how long it took between the moment Andy Griffith drew his last breath on the morning of July 3, 2012, and the moment North Carolina red clay closed over his grave. No public announcement. No memorial service, no cameras, no farewell. By the time CNN broke the news at 11:47 a.m. Eastern Time, Sheriff Andy Taylor was already 6 feet under. The backlash was immediate. Fans called it cruel. The media called it suspicious. One tabloid ran the headline, "What was Andy Griffith hiding?" But here's what nobody understood then, and what most people still don't understand now. Andy Griffith wasn't hiding anything. He was protecting everything. The truth behind those 4 hours has nothing to do with scandal, and everything to do with a man who spent 60 years giving America exactly what it needed, a version of himself so perfect, so warm, so decent that the country wrapped itself in it like a blanket, while he quietly, desperately fought to keep one thing sacred: the man underneath. This is the story of that fight, and why, in the end, the most beloved man in American television history chose to disappear in less time than it takes to watch 5 episodes of the show that made him immortal. The morning Andy Griffith died, his wife Cindy made 3 phone calls. The first was to their family attorney. The second was to a funeral director on Roanoke Island who had been on standby for weeks. The third was to a North Carolina county clerk who arrived at the Griffith property within 90 minutes with pre-approved permits that most families wait days to obtain. By 2:34 p.m., while Good Morning America was still preparing their tribute segment, while President Obama's press secretary was drafting a statement, while Ron Howard was boarding a plane to North Carolina, Andy Griffith's body was already at rest in an unmarked grave on his own property, surrounded by live oaks and the smell of salt water. It was legal. Barely. North Carolina law permits private burials on residential property under specific conditions, but the speed, the secrecy, the surgical precision of it, that was something else entirely. 3 questions haunted the news cycle for weeks. Why the rush? What was in his will that demanded this kind of invisibility? And what does it say about a man that he denied an entire generation the chance to grieve him publicly? The answers are buried in places most people never looked. Not in his final years, but in his first ones. Not in Mayberry, but in the poverty that came before it. Not in the warmth of Sheriff Andy Taylor, but in the darkness of lonesome roads. To understand why Andy Griffith was in the ground before America even knew he was gone, you have to understand the trade he made in 1960 and what that trade cost him. But first, you have to go back to a town that smelled like tobacco and red clay. Back to a house with no running water. Back to a boy who discovered that the only way out was to give people a version of himself they could love, even if it meant burying the real version so deep, not even he could find it anymore. Mount Airy, North Carolina, 1926. If you've never been, picture this: the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance, closer than hope but farther than money could get you. Streets that turn to red mud when it rains. The constant smell of tobacco curing in barns. A place where everyone knows your family's business because privacy is a luxury reserved for people with doors that lock. Andy Samuel Griffith was born there on June 1st, in a house on Haymore Street that his parents didn't own. Carl Lee Griffith, his father, worked as a carpenter when there was work, and as whatever pays the bills when there wasn't. His mother, Geneva, took in laundry. Between them, they earned just enough to keep their only child fed, but never quite enough to keep him warm. The house had 3 rooms, no electricity until Andy was 7, no indoor plumbing until he was almost grown. In winter, the family slept in the same room because it was the only one with a wood stove. Andy would later describe those years with the careful politeness of a man who never wanted to sound bitter. "We were poor," he'd say in interviews, "but we didn't know it because everyone else was too." But his cousin, Emmett Forrest, remembered it differently. In a 1996 interview with the Winston-Salem Journal, he said, "Andy knew. He knew when other boys had new shoes and he had cardboard in his. He knew when other families had meat on Sundays and we had beans. He didn't talk about it, but his eyes. You could see him counting the cost of things even then." What saved him, what literally saved his life from becoming a smaller, harder version of his father's, was his voice. Grace Moravian Church sat on a hill half a mile from the Griffith house. Geneva took Andy there every Sunday, even when Carl stayed home, even when they had nothing to put in the collection plate. The church choir director, a woman named Mrs. Catherine Everhart, heard 6-year-old Andy singing along one morning and stopped mid-hymn. "Whose boy is that?" she asked. "That voice." Even at 6 years old, it had a quality that didn't make sense. Low and unhurried, warm as August honey, a voice that sounded like it came from a man who had lived 3 lifetimes and found peace at the end of them. Mrs. Everhart pulled Andy into the choir that same day. By the time he was 10, he was singing solos. By the time he was 12, people were driving from neighboring counties just to hear him. His high school music teacher, Edna Mickey, saw something else. Not just a voice, but a presence, an ease in front of people that seemed impossible for a boy who wore the same shirt 3 days a week and brought his lunch in a paper sack. She cast him in every school play, every musical production, every talent show. Andy never looked nervous, she told the Mount Airy News in 1961, after the Andy Griffith Show had made him famous. Even when he forgot his lines, even when the set fell apart, he just smiled at the audience like they were in on the joke. Like whatever went wrong was part of the plan. That smile, that ease, it wasn't natural, it was armor. Andy Griffith learned early that if you could make people feel good, they didn't ask uncomfortable questions, they didn't notice your shoes. They didn't count how many times you wore the same shirt. If you could make them laugh, make them feel safe, they let you in. And once you were in, the world stopped feeling so cold. In 1944, Andy Griffith did something almost no one from his neighborhood had ever done. He went to college. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill was only 80 miles from Mount Airy. It might as well have been another planet. He arrived with $50 his mother had saved in a coffee can, 2 changes of clothes, and a full scholarship he'd earned by singing at a competition in Greensboro. Chapel Hill was full of boys from Raleigh and Charlotte, boys whose fathers were doctors and lawyers, boys who'd never had cardboard in their shoes or skipped meals so their parents could eat. Andy watched them, studied them, the way they walked, the way they talked, the easy confidence of people who'd never had to apologize for existing. He majored in music, studied voice and trombone, joined a fraternity because a professor told him it would help his career, learned to drink bourbon and tell jokes and be the guy everyone wanted at their party. But he also learned something darker. He learned that performance wasn't just for the stage. If you performed well enough in every interaction, people never saw past it. They never asked what you were hiding. They never wondered if the easy laugh and the folksy charm were covering something raw. Andy graduated in 1949, returned to North Carolina, taught music for a year at Goldsboro High School, and hated every second of it. Not because he didn't like kids, but because teaching felt like giving up, like admitting that the voice, the presence, the thing Mrs. Everhart had heard in that church choir, that it wasn't special enough to matter outside of Mount Airy. So he made a decision that his father called foolish and his mother called faith. He quit and started performing the comedy routine at county fairs and Rotary Club dinners, playing a character he'd invented, a slow-talking country boy trying to make sense of the modern world. The bit that changed everything was called What It Was Football. It was a monologue told from the perspective of a rural preacher who stumbles onto a college football game and describes it with wide-eyed confusion. The humor came from the character's innocence, his genuine bewilderment at why grown men would chase a punt can up and down a field while thousands of people watched. Andy recorded it in 1953 in a Raleigh studio, pressed 500 copies, sold them at a shows for $1 each. Within 6 months, it had sold over 800,000 copies nationwide. Overnight, Andy Griffith went from teaching music to rural teenagers to being a national sensation. But here's the thing nobody understood then, and what Andy himself wouldn't articulate for decades. The character in that routine, the innocent, sweet, confused country boy, wasn't him. It was a mask he was about to wear for the next 60 years. Broadway, 1955. The play was called No Time for Sergeants. Andy played Will Stockdale, a Georgia farm boy who gets drafted into the Air Force and accidentally causes chaos due sheer weaponized innocence. Opening night was October 20th at the Alvin Theater. By the time the curtain fell, Andy Griffith had received a standing ovation that lasted 7 minutes. The New York Times called it the most disarming comic performance in a generation. Walter Kerr wrote, Mr. Percival, Griffith has invented a new kind of leading man, one who wins by surrendering, who charms by confessing ignorance. The show ran for 796 performances, and Hollywood, which had been watching from a distance, moved closer. In 1957, Andy starred in the film adaptation of No Time for Sergeants. It was a box office hit. Warner Brothers offered him a 7-picture deal, but then something happened that almost nobody saw coming. Director Elia Kazan, one of the most respected auteurs in cinema, the man who directed Marlon Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire, cast Andy Griffith in a film that was the complete opposite of Will Stockdale. The film was A Face in the Crowd, and the character was a man named Lonesome Rhodes. Lonesome Rhodes was a drifter, a guitar-playing conman discovered in an Arkansas jail by a radio producer who thought his folksy charm would play well on air. And it did. Rhodes became a media sensation, a television star, beloved by millions. But in private, he was venomous, contemptuous of the very people who adored him, a manipulator who used his aw shucks persona to seduce the public into blind worship while privately mocking them as morons and sheep. The final scene of the film shows Rhodes's career imploding after his microphone stays on during a commercial break, broadcasting his real feelings to millions. The audience hears what he actually thinks of them, and they destroy him for it. Andy Griffith's performance in that film is terrifying, not because he's playing a villain, but because you can see in his eyes that he understands this man. That some part of him has felt what Lonesome Rhodes feels, the exhaustion of being loved for a version of yourself that doesn't exist. Critics called it a revelation. Kazan said it was one of the finest screen debuts he'd ever witnessed. The film bombed at the box office. Audiences didn't want to see Andy Griffith as a monster. They wanted Will Stockdale. They wanted the country boy with the heart of gold. And Hollywood, which runs on desire rather than artistry, listened. In 1960, a television producer named Sheldon Leonard approached Andy with an idea, a sitcom. Set in a small North Carolina town, Andy would play the sheriff, a widower raising his young son, keeping the peace with patience instead of force, solving problems with wisdom instead of weapons. It would be warm, gentle, moral without being preachy. It would be the antidote to every anxiety simmering in 1960s America. Andy said yes. The Andy Griffith Show premiered on October 3, 1960. By the end of its first season, it was the 4th most-watched program in America. By its final season in 1968, it was number 1. For 8 years, Sheriff Andy Taylor was the moral center of American television. He taught his son, Opie, about honesty, kindness, and responsibility. He managed his bumbling deputy, Barney Fife, with patience and affection. He courted women with old-fashioned chivalry. He solved disputes with a gentle word instead of a gun. Mayberry wasn't just a fictional town. It was a promise, a vision of an America that maybe never existed, but that people desperately wanted to believe in. And Andy Griffith delivered that promise every single week. Warm, steady, unshakable. But the cost of that warmth was silence. The people who worked with Andy during those years describe a man of profound contradictions. Don Knotts, his co-star and closest friend on set, once said, "Andy was the kindest man I ever knew, and the most unreachable." There were moments of explosive anger, scripts thrown across the room when a scene wasn't working, crew members stressed down for mistakes so small no one else would have noticed, and then, an hour later, Andy would apologize, quietly, sincerely. "I'm sorry," he'd say. I want it to be right." But what did right mean to a man playing a character so decent, so morally uncomplicated, that he could never quite match it in real life? His first marriage to Barbara Bray Edwards, his college sweetheart, was disintegrating. They'd married in 1949, had 2 children, Andy Jr., called Sam, and an adopted daughter, Dixie. But fame had done its quiet, relentless work. Andy was gone for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. When he came home, he brought Sheriff Andy Taylor with him, the patience, the warmth, the gentle lessons. Except it wasn't real. It was exhausting. Barbara filed for divorce in 1972. Sam, their son, would later struggle with alcoholism. He died in 1996 at age 38, his relationship with his father still fractured. Dixie rarely spoke about her childhood. When she did, her words were careful, measured. "Dad was complicated," she told People magazine in 2015. "He loved us, I know that, but I think he loved the idea of us more than the reality." Andy remarried in 1973 to a Greek actress named Salika Kasuto. It lasted 6 years. By the late 1970s, Andy Griffith was professionally adrift. He'd left The Andy Griffith Show in 1968 at its peak, hoping to prove he was more than Mayberry. He tried dramatic films, television movies, a variety special that CBS canceled after one season. Nothing worked. Critics who had once praised his range in A Face in the Crowd seem to have forgotten that performance entirely. The public wanted one thing from Andy Griffith. They wanted him to come home to Mayberry, and he refused. For a decade, he wandered. Respected, but not relevant. Beloved, but not watched. The particular loneliness of a man who had once been everywhere and was now, somehow, nowhere. And then his body betrayed him. In January 1983, Andy Griffith woke up and couldn't move his legs. At first, he thought it was a pinched nerve, a pulled muscle, something that would resolve itself with rest. By the afternoon, he couldn't move his arms. By evening, he couldn't breathe without assistance. The diagnosis was Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disorder where the body's immune system attacks the peripheral nervous system, causing progressive paralysis. There's no cure. No way to stop it once it starts. You just wait, immobilized, while your own body decides whether to kill you or let you live. Andy spent weeks in the ICU at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, unable to move, unable to speak, tethered to machines that breathed for him. His third wife, Cindy Knight, a former teacher he'd married just months before the illness struck, never left his side. She read to him, played music, held his hand while doctors told her, quietly, that there was a strong chance he'd never walk again. For a man whose entire identity was built on presence on commanding a stage, filling a screen, walking into a room and making people feel safe, the paralysis was a kind of death that didn't have the mercy to finish the job. "I was trapped," Andy said in a 1985 interview with Barbara Walters. It was one of the only times he spoke publicly about the illness. "Trapped in my own body. And all I could think was, is this it? Is this how it ends? Not on a stage, not doing something I love, just stuck. Invisible." He recovered, slowly. Physical therapy that lasted months. Learning to walk again like a toddler, regaining strength in his hands, his arms, his voice. But he was never the same. The people who worked with him in the years after noticed a difference. A new guardedness. A man who moved through the world like someone who no longer fully trusted it. In 1986, Andy Griffith returned to television in Matlock. He played Ben Matlock, a folksy Atlanta defense attorney who solved cases with small-town charm and courtroom brilliance. It was, in many ways, a return to Sheriff Andy Taylor. The warmth, the wit, the southern cadence that made people feel like they were sitting on a porch swing, listening to a trusted friend. But there was something sharper in Matlock. Something that allowed Andy to bring the complexity he'd never been permitted to show in Mayberry. Matlock could be calculating, manipulative. He'd use his aw shucks routine to lull witnesses into confessing, then pivot into ruthless cross-examination. The mask was still there, but now the audience was in on the trick. The show ran for 9 seasons, made Andy, improbably, a television star for the second time in his life. But by the mid-1990s, he was done. Done with the 12-hour days, done with the scripts, done with being everyone's idea of decency when he barely had the energy to be decent to himself. He retired to Roanoke Island, North Carolina, a place where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Pamlico Sound, where the tourists come for the beaches and leave before sunset, where a man could walk to his mailbox without someone calling him sheriff or asking for a picture. Cindy was with him, finally a marriage that held. And for the first time in 60 years, Andy Griffith tried to figure out who he was when he wasn't performing. The final decade of Andy Griffith's life was the quietest. He gave almost no interviews, made almost no public appearances, turned down reunion specials and tributes and Lifetime Achievement Awards. Ron Howard called him once a month. They'd talk about fishing, about nothing. "I think Andy was tired," Howard said in a 2013 interview. "Not physically, spiritually, tired of being a symbol." In private conversations with friends, Andy started talking about death, not morbidly, practically. He'd watched what happened to other celebrities when they died. The media circus, the cameras outside hospitals, the televised memorials that felt more like entertainment than grief. He'd seen how Michael Jackson's death became a spectacle, how mourning became content. And he wanted none of it. In 2010, Andy drafted a will with extraordinarily specific instructions. He researched North Carolina's private burial laws, made sure his property qualified, pre-filed permits with the county clerk, He told Cindy exactly what he wanted. "When I go, I want it fast. I want it private. I want it over before the world turns it into a show," she promised. And on the morning of July 3rd, 2012, she kept that promise. Andy Griffith woke for the last time just after dawn. His heart, weakened by age and illness, was failing. He'd known it was coming. His doctors had told him weeks earlier that it was a matter of days. Cindy was beside him. He died at 7:02 a.m. Within minutes, the plan they'd spent 2 years preparing went into motion. Cindy called the family attorney, then the funeral director, then the county clerk, who arrived at the property within 90 minutes with permits that had been pre-approved and pre-signed. There was no embalming, no casket viewing, no service. By North Carolina law, a body can be buried on private property if the land meets specific requirements: minimum acreage, distance from water sources, proper documentation. Andy's property qualified. At 11:19 a.m., 4 hours and 17 minutes after his death, Andy Griffith was buried in a grave beneath a live oak tree 70 feet from the house where he'd spent his final years. No minister, no eulogy, no cameras, just Cindy. Just the sound of waves in the distance, just red Carolina soil covering a man who had spent his entire life being seen and wanted, in the end, to disappear. By the time the news broke at 11:47 a.m., it was already over. Journalists rushed to Roanoke Island and found nothing to photograph. The grave was on private property, invisible from any public road. Fans were devastated. Social media erupted with grief and confusion. How could they do this? Didn't we deserve to say goodbye? He belonged to all of us. But that last statement, "he belonged to all of us," is exactly what Andy Griffith had spent his final years rejecting. Sheriff Andy Taylor belonged to everyone. Andy Griffith belonged to no one but himself. And that distinction, the fierce protection of it, was the final act of a man who had spent 60 years giving the public everything it asked for, except this. Ron Howard released a statement 3 days later. "Andy was my second father. He taught me about acting, about integrity, about doing the work and going home. That's what he did. He did the work, and then he went home. I'll miss him. But I understand why he left the way he did. That was Andy. He did things his way." Don Knotts had died 6 years earlier, sparing him the knowledge of this final chapter. But those who knew both men well said Knotts would have understood, would have smiled even. "That stubborn bastard," he would have said with affection. The grave remains unmarked to outsiders. There is no plaque, no historical marker, no GPS coordinates shared online. Tour buses still roll through Mount Airy, the real Mayberry, where visitors can see Floyd's barbershop and Opie's childhood home. But Roanoke Island keeps it secret. The island doesn't advertise itself as the final resting place of a legend, because Andy Griffith didn't want to be a legend. He wanted to be a man, and in the end, he got what he wanted. There is a question that lingers long after the facts are understood. Did Andy Griffith owe us a public goodbye? It depends on which version of him you're mourning. If you're mourning Sheriff Andy Taylor, the man who taught Opie about honesty, who made Mayberry feel real, who gave America a vision of decency when the world felt like it was falling apart, then maybe the hurt is legitimate. That character was built from public love, sustained by public loyalty. He belonged in some sense to all of us. But if you're mourning Andy Samuel Griffith, the boy from Mount Airy who grew up with cardboard in his shoes, who discovered his voice in a church choir, who spent 60 years performing warmth while protecting the wounds underneath, then the burial makes perfect sense. That man had earned his privacy, earned it with every season of Mayberry, every handshake with a stranger who called him sheriff, every interview where he smiled and gave the answers people wanted instead of the truth. He'd spent his whole life being a symbol, and symbols don't get to be human. So, he made a choice. In the final hours of his life, Andy Griffith chose himself. Not the character, not the legacy, not the version the world loved. Himself. The lesson Andy Griffith taught us isn't complicated. Fame is a costume. Wear it long enough and people forget you have a body underneath. The bravest thing you can do in a world that wants to own you is to remember that you don't belong to it. Andy remembered. Even at the end. Especially at the end. 4 hours and 17 minutes after he drew his last breath on a summer morning in North Carolina, the earth closed over him. The cameras never came. The networks never got their finale. This spectacle never materialized. Just the island, just the silence, just a man finally completely at peace. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the life you perform versus a life you actually live, subscribe for more untold stories about the people who shaped our world, the real ones, the ones behind the cameras, the ones that don't make it into the highlight reels, because those are always the stories worth telling.